Everyone, my name is Dana and I work with AECOM, and today for this last presentation I wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about the policies that create the opportunities for us to implement some of the important energy efficiency work that we heard about from all of our previous speakers. So I think on this slide in particular, there's nothing newsworthy. I think we all understand and recognize that we will not be able to achieve climate neutrality efficiently or effectively simply by changing the source and supply of our energy. But what we have to do is in tandem be reassessing and reevaluating how we consume and use our energy as well. Energy efficiency policies, and that's kind of the entry point for energy efficiency policies. They represent 40% of the emissions abatement required by 2040, and they are a critical strategy to accelerating, or I would say potentially even meeting, the decarbonization goals that we have. So one of the things that's especially interesting when we look at energy efficiency policies that have been successful is that they are kind of rooted in this sense of they have a few things in common. One of them is that they are rooted in meeting some of the specific community needs and priorities that they are serving. They also look at integrating equity components, prioritizing positive economic impacts for the communities that they're serving, and also really emphasizing a broad-based stakeholder coordination. So on this slide, I have 3 examples of energy efficiency policies that have been quite interesting, and on 3 different scales. So we have something that is on the national stage, a state level, and then a city level. So starting with the National Action Plan for Energy Efficiency, and this is an example of how successful private-public initiatives can be. This is a private-public initiative. It really demonstrates the national commitment to energy efficiency, and it was led by 60 stakeholders that convened, and they represented a stakeholder representation of utilities, local governments, environmental advocacy groups, really a nice cross-section there. And what they did is they got together and they identified barriers that prevent communities from successfully implementing energy efficiency. And together they came up with recommendations and mitigation measures that they convened into this report. And the result is a deliverable that 49 states have signed off and used as a basis for some of the commitments that they've made. And it's almost a toolkit for states and local governments to be using. It includes guides and fact sheets and different types of tools. The second example of an interesting energy efficiency initiative here is with Maine. So the Maine energy efficiency efforts have been led by Efficiency Maine and Maine Housing. And the reason why Maine is on here, it's usually not one of the most noteworthy states that we talk about, is the ACEEE does an energy efficiency scorecard. And in 2022, Maine was designated the most improved state, which means that their approach to energy efficiency has really enabled them to pivot quite effectively and achieve some of the goals that they have. So their goals are really rooted in a couple of, it's like 3 different key approaches. So the first is they focused on heat pump installation. So they have a goal of 100,000 new heat pumps that they would install by 2025. And in, again, a nod to equity, they have designated about 15% of those to be provided to low-income population segments. The second effort that they focused on is accelerating the speed of home weatherization. So their goal is 35,000 homes to be home weatherized by 2030, and then they have an allocation amongst that goal to have 1,000 homes every year be home weatherized for low-income communities. They've also, and Jessica was talking about this with policies, they've integrated statewide rebates and incentives and energy efficiency programs, and then revisited the building codes that they have to incorporate an angle for energy efficiency. The third policy on this slide here is on the city level. So this is Local Law 97. It is one of the most ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction plans that we see, and it was passed in 2019 as part of the city's Green City New Deal. And what's interesting about Local Law 97 is that it's really grounded in this sense of the city understanding what drives emissions for them locally, which is buildings. About 2/3 of emissions in the city of New York are driven by buildings. And so their approach is to take the city's largest buildings that are over 25,000 square feet, and implement pretty aggressive emission reduction targets for those buildings. So they are expected to reduce the emissions that they're producing by 40% by 2030, and then by 2050, another more stringent expectation is to reduce by 80%. And then again, with that broad-based stakeholder coordination, Local Law 97 also has an allocation to establish the Local Law 97 Advisory Board and the Climate Working Group and that is a stakeholder working group and advisory board that regularly convenes and kind of monitors the progress and makes recommendations as needed to help this initiative keep moving forward successfully. And I don't know if we have a plug for this laptop because it's giving me the low battery sign. So another example of how some of these policies get supported is financial incentives. And this is a pretty simple slide, and the main takeaway here is that energy efficiency is only one decarbonization initiative amongst many. And there are many different financial incentives that support different decarbonization initiatives. So for example, we see our IIJA grants and state and local incentives can be used to support energy conservation and efficiency, but then we see other things like the IRA tax incentives that can support on-site solar and energy storage. So kind of the key takeaway point here is that energy efficiency can be used to support other decarbonization initiatives and vice versa in order to capture and leverage more financial incentives so you get a more effective implementation strategy. So for example, if we look at all of the guidance that we're receiving around increasing electrification, like the DoD has just recently come out with all DoD components, operations and building, they need to be electrified. That is a very good entry point to start to also introduce energy efficiency initiatives and harness the financial incentives that are available. So kind of a case study about that is with San Diego Gas and Electric. So San Diego Gas and Electric, SDG&E, they have a sustainable action plan. It's intended to be a roadmap for them to meet some pretty aggressive and ambitious decarbonization goals. And those goals are that their SDG&E facilities has committed that by 2030, they will have achieved net zero energy, a 50% water reduction, and a 100% waste diversion. So pretty ambitious goals. And so in order to help identify the best pathway to do that, they implemented a net zero audit. And that net zero audit included an audit of 61 facilities within the SDG&E facilities department, and it was looking at identifying the most cost-effective pathway in achieving these net zero goals. And so the most cost-effective pathway was to convert the gas heating systems to electric heat pumps, because that resulted in a lower energy requirement of the heat pumps, and it reduced the on-site energy generation investments to reach net zero. But oftentimes, electrification of natural gas systems can also result in higher electric operating costs, sometimes on a scale of 2 to 4 times higher. So what's interesting here is that by introducing energy efficiency investments, you can help subsidize the cost of zero carbon electrification projects. So for example, with SDG&E, one of the recommendations that was made was to combine these natural gas rooftop units with LED lighting upgrades and controls optimization projects. And that was able to take an ROI that was initially analyzed to be at about 60 years and make that an ROI of about a little less than 10 years, which is a very significant difference when you're doing strategic planning for how you're going to fund and implement certain strategies within your organization. Another case study is with Con Edison. So on the East Coast, they have this larger, broader cost of electrification study that they've been doing, and one of the smaller pieces of that study was to look at the impact of weatherization on electrification costs for low-rise multifamily buildings in New York. And for the purposes of this work, the weatherization was defined as upgrading the windows and ensuring that they were code compliant. It included ensuring wall insulation was code compliant, and then air sealing to reduce infiltration. And for this work, the modeling was done with the DOE commercial reference building energy model, and it showed a 50% reduction in peak load, as well as a 40% reduction in overall system cost. And that accounted for equipment, controls, contracting, because in the case of Con Edison, the modeling demonstrated that by implementing energy efficiency initiatives and reducing the heating and cooling loads, we were able to also reduce the necessity of newer equipment, which was quite expensive for Con Edison. So to wrap up, energy efficiency, if there's anything that we can take away from my short time up here today, it's that energy efficiency can not only accelerate our ability to meet decarbonization goals, but also enable us to do so in ways that are cost effective. And there's kind of 4 best practices to achieving that. The first is to look at existing decarbonization efforts and see how energy efficiency initiatives can build upon those. The second is to look at those quick wins, look at what is driving emissions within your specific area or project, and really go after those. And the third is to look at data-driven, digitally supported analytics to model scenarios. And that's not just modeling in terms of how much can we achieve in emissions reduction, it's looking at that holistic life cycle analysis type of modeling that allows you to not only get a sense of what you can achieve from a decarbonization standpoint, but also from the investment standpoint and feasibility standpoint, which brings us to that final bullet about leveraging financial mechanisms to really make it easier to actually implement and get these initiatives in place. And with that, thank you so much.
Yeah, we have some just a few minutes time, and I leave two questions. Okay, or just leave the space for two people, or give question, or just give the brief expression. Okay, please.
But they're organizing a
Yeah, anyone?
So
Yeah,
I know
Maza.
the next session is coming in. I just wanted to say I am the only female candidate in the upcoming
Introduce your
elections.
name.
Marjana Armstrong. Yeah, so I'm one of the 7 candidates for the positions for the governing board in 2024. I've been here throughout the session, didn't really get an opportunity to say something. I just wanted to encourage you to follow the path of volunteering just like I did, and if I can get your support during the elections, I would appreciate that. More information about me is available on the ICCS website under elections, so please vote for your favorite candidates, and thank you so much for listening.
I'm sorry, because our next session people had come already. Please come here, we take a photo together, okay?